Say friends, my name is Fergus, and I'd like to talk about my approach to Forrest Fenn and the thrill of the chase. Timestamps will be in my description, and I'll be sure to mark what I consider to be the why didn't I think of that aspect, and shortly after that there's going to be a point where I discuss most of my clues and my blueprint in a short span, so you can jump right to that if you want to skip my background quotes. But I thought some people might want to follow my overall thought process, and regardless, there's an experiment in about 2 minutes that I think you should try before you skip. If you're not familiar with Forrest Fenn, you probably clicked on the wrong video, but briefly, Forrest Fenn was an Air Force pilot who served in Vietnam, and after retiring from the Air Force as a major, became a highly successful art dealer in Santa Fe, where his gallery grossed about $6 million a year. In 1988, he thought he was going to die as a result of a cancer. In response, he decided he was going to hide a treasure chest for others to seek. And his original plan was to die with the chest in his chosen spot, which, according to Forrest, was very special. He ended up surviving the cancer, but decided to hide the chest anyway, and in 2010 published a book called The Thrill of the Chase that contained a poem that, if followed precisely, would lead to the treasure. This is a version of the poem that was published in 2013 in the book Too Far to Walk. The treasure has been retrieved, but the location and the meaning of the clues have not been revealed as of this recording, and Forrest has since passed away. I think it's worth pausing to read a few times before going forward if you're not familiar with it or it's easy to find online. For the record, I do not claim to have gotten anything correct about Forrest or the poem, but maybe the community working together can still figure this out. So that's one reason I made this video. Maybe an idea I had will help piece it together in the correct spot. And if nothing else, I think my approach is a decent proof of concept of how 9 clues, if followed precisely, can lead you to a place to put a 10 by 10 inch box. But the other reason I made this video is so maybe I can get closure. Regarding my time in the chase, I first heard about Forrest Fenn in the fall of 2019, and I wanted to know what could make a spot so special to Forrest, and also compare it to my special spot. I received my copy of The Thrill of the Chase in October of 2019, and eventually found myself on a plane headed to Wyoming in obviously October of 2019. And this is the story of several trips all to the same spot between October and my last one in early March 2020 before things shut down. But to my experiment, it involves poor Douglas Preston, who has been accused of knowing the spot because he made a statement about Forrest making the poem harder. The obvious explanation is that Forrest told him it got harder over the years, but regardless, I'm about to show 2 versions of the poem. One is the version as published in Too Far to Walk. The other is an edited version that differs by 1 letter. And if you like, feel free to pause the video and see if you can guess which version is easier as it relates to my approach. They both work, but one is significantly easier in my opinion. If you guess correctly, and especially if you can guess why the easier version is easier, please issue a public apology to Douglas Preston and suggest that he name a character in his next book, either Fergus or jammies after my dog in exchange for clearing some of the shade on his name. And I'm not claiming this is what got changed, but it's just to demonstrate that it might not be as hard as you think to tell which version of a poem is easier or contains more information. But if you don't want to risk a spoiler to my punchline, just don't read it. Okay, here come the poems. Okay, poems are gone. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the term Fenny, which some searchers have used to describe how certain places feel as potential hiding spots, somewhat based on appearances or how people expect Forrest's special spot to look or feel. But regarding objects that Forrest valued, Forrest addressed at least one of his cherished objects being the first arrowhead he found. And there's nothing objectively special about the arrowhead, but rather it's what it means to him and the story attached to it involving his dad. I'm guessing most treasure hunters recognize this scene from Indiana Jones where Elsa hands Donovan a grail she knows to be false while Indiana and Ron sit back and watch. And Donovan is willing to accept it based on appearances and what he thinks the grail ought to look like. But part of me wondered whether this was a type of trap to avoid when it came to the chase. I don't mean to insult anyone who searched Yellowstone, especially since the circumstantial evidence points there. And personally, I love Yellowstone, and I think it would be funny if Forrest hid it there, but I just did not see how the clues fit there. Pretty much any background picture in my presentation that isn't from my search trips is from my 2006 summer in Yellowstone that either me or my friend took, and I figured this would be a good way to introduce myself. This is my special spot. It's an average valley in Yellowstone. Nothing objectively stunning, and this picture was taken right by the road. My friend and I spent almost every weekend of a summer camping in Yellowstone and coming to this one valley with spotting scopes we rented from the general store in Silvergate, because this is where wolves were hanging out. There was a pack that routinely hung out in this valley where we could sit by the road and watch them. And we were freehand holding our digital cameras up to the spotting scopes, so our janky pictures are inherently low resolution given the setup, but they're some of my favorite pictures of wildlife I have. And each day we'd arrive at the spot early in the day when the wolves would be active, and then go do a hike during the day and come back again in the evening. And we usually had the spot to ourselves since most of the regulars were spotting in Lamar. One morning, we arrived right as the sun was coming up. Nobody else was around, and the pack was howling. And it was the only time we heard them do that or could hear them at all. And there was one moment that was really impressive, and it was when the parent female, which is this one, let out a real iconic howl. And as it turns out, my friend managed to capture the moment on video, but it doesn't have quite the same effect on tape, and you might need headphones to catch the tone. But this is the video, and this is where the parent female is going to be, and there's a delay since we're so far away, but have a listen. Just take my word for it, that tone was amazing in real life. So why do I show all of this objectively unimpressive footage from an average valley? Well, that's kind of my point. I haven't been back there in over 10 years, but I'll never forget this place or what I saw and heard there. And somewhere along this valley is where my ashes are going to be someday. And this is what I wanted to compare to Forrest's spot. Would I experience maybe just a hint of what made the spot special to him, or is it a spot where the importance might only ever be known to Forrest because it's a simple place with a story? And this is why I was not in love with a narrow usage for the word Fenny or basing it on appearances, since I knew my cherished possessions included grainy images and video, and what made my spot important to me had really nothing to do with aesthetics, even though I was in Yellowstone. So, in the same way that Forrest didn't pick his first arrowhead to be special, or that a crude grave marker gave meaning to a spot in Vietnam, I'd be surprised if he made an active choice to have a spot be special based largely on appearances. To be clear though, if I say anything that disagrees with what someone else has said, it's just how I saw things rather than an attempt to criticize, since I didn't find the spot either. I owe the community in general a thank you, since I wouldn't have gotten involved in the chase if the community had not built up the popularity to the point where it crossed my path. And especially for AGK, who I think coined the term Fenny, I don't know if I would have found the chase without the Moby Dickens recording and all they did to put out content. I have a few things to discuss in terms of background quotes, and they all generally involve treating things outside the poem broadly. I'm a chemist by training, but my job mainly involves analyzing broad constructions of language, and I tried to apply that as best I could with the chase. So if there are multiple ways to interpret something outside the poem, I'm not likely to use it, or at least not likely to pick one specific interpretation and run with it. And some things I was willing to accept at face value, like elevations or safety issues where the treasure chest is not underwater, but anything else I tried to treat broadly. As an example, let's take this statement where some searchers took the phrase "the mountains north of Santa Fe" to mean a specific set of mountains, in particular those in New Mexico. The specific phrase "somewhere in the mountains north of Santa Fe" has been mentioned pretty frequently according to Google, but that sentence is not in The Thrill of the Chase. This is how it's stated in The Thrill of the Chase. The word "somewhere" is splitting the phrase "the mountains north of Santa Fe." At least to my ear, this sounds less like a reference to a specific set of mountains within a singular state. And it might be partly because it's more natural to say "somewhere in the mountains," but the book phrase seems to be less frequently cited or stated, and even some guy named Forrest Fenn was quoted by Margie Goldsmith as having said it the non-book way, but who knows if that was transcribed accurately. And either way, I've caught myself saying it the non-book way just because it's so natural. But I don't think this is a trivial rearrangement. For instance, let's say we're in the kitchen trying to find a jar that Forrest hid in one of the cabinets, and then let's say he gives you the hint the jar is somewhere in the cabinet left of the oven. That might lead you to one particular cabinet, or most people will at least start there and exhaust it first, since the word "somewhere" seems to be modifying the cabinet. But let's say instead he gives you the hint the jar is in the cabinet somewhere left of the oven. Now, I'm definitely not sure he he's trying to call out a specific cabinet since somewhere is modifying the direction left. You could argue that's not grammatically correct, and you should say a cabinet somewhere left of the oven, but that's kind of my point. You wouldn't use an indefinite article on mountains since it's already an indefinite class. Like how I say, if I ever lose my job, I'm going to go live in the woods. I'm not necessarily referring to one particular forest or set of trees. My case here is that, especially for the written word, Forrest chooses to say things in a particular way, and paraphrasing or rearranging his words and then making an interpretation can be dangerous. And in this situation, moving the word somewhere in the book can change what's actually being modified in the statement, and the book statement seems to be a broader description of a search area. As an example, outside the book, in this statement, Forrest refers to marrying the clues to a place on a map. It's possible that Forrest means each clue is a separate place on a map, but it could also be the case that every clue will be applied to a singular place on a map, and these species are not exhaustive, and each has questions like, how big's the place, or how resolved is your map? So, in viewing things broadly, this quote didn't seem especially useful other than maybe look at maps, but who knows which ones. But if you did pick one species from the jump, you could be unnecessarily limiting yourself. And on the topic of maps, and I don't mean to imply that this quote should be spliced with the previous one, but I think the little girl in India is a good example of being careful with Forrest's words, especially when he's answering a question. If I were going to read into one of his answers, I felt like I needed to be sure I knew how Forrest interpreted the question. Jenny Kyle's question here asks, can a little girl in India who speaks good English but only has your poem and a map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains work out where the treasure is? It might be that Forrest has a particular idea of what a map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains would be and the level of resolution on that type of map. You know, if you walk into a map store and you says to the guy, I need a map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains, and he handed you a map of Yellowstone with all its hot springs, would you say he fulfilled your request? You know, is an atlas of Vermont a map of the United States? It might depend on who you ask. So Forrest might think a map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains is referring to a particular level of resolution that could show the entire U.S. Rocky Mountains, which is not a novel idea if you've seen the Odious Souls video on the little girl in India. So when Forrest answers and says the little girl in India cannot get closer than the first two clues, it might be entirely dependent on what map he's envisioning. And regardless, we still have to figure out exactly what he means by his answer. Does he mean you could get both from that map? Or maybe just something related to the second? Or does he mean that it might be very difficult to get one or both of the first two from a map, but the third and or later ones are just impossible to get off a map? Forrest harped on the first clue and mentioned maps, but I've not been able to find a quote where Forrest explicitly stated that the first clue is readily identifiable on most maps. The location of my first clue is indispensable because of reasons, but I don't think many maps of the full U.S. Rocky Mountains would be resolved enough to show it. I'm generally not sure if clues 1 and 2 are separated for both to be distinctly labeled or depicted on many maps in view of this quote, since this is a very strange use of the pronoun there to say searchers continue to figure the first 2 clues and others arrive there. If clues 1 and 2 are separated far enough apart where they could both be labeled on a lot of maps, this is a very strange way to structure the sentence. It's Forrest, so strange is normal, and maybe he was referring to quote there from an instance in the poem, but my point is, I don't see a clear way to use the little girl in India to dictate how and which maps I should analyze. And especially if you think the first clue involves a literal temperature of water for begin it where warm waters halt, that's going to be tough for a little girl in India looking at maps, since it's not even clear if Forrest interpreted the question to mean that the little girl has only maps and not, for instance, internet access to do research. With the little girl in India, it might be a question of what Forrest thought was built into the question, but that might be a larger issue where people are building assumptions into questions that cause Forrest to answer in seemingly strange ways. Like in this quote where someone asks how far the chest is located from the blaze, and Forrest states he did not take the measurement and concludes by stating that if the questioner finds the blaze, the answer to the question will be obvious. The most common interpretation I've heard is that if you find the blaze, you will know where the chest is. But Forrest's answer only states that if you find the blaze, the answer will be obvious, not that if you find the blaze and the chest. Besides that, the question is not where is the chest located in relation to the blaze, the question is how far is it? Even assuming you can automatically locate the chest, I'd be surprised if many people can say the distance between any 2 even well-defined points out in nature is obvious. Like if I asked you what the distance is between the tips of this bison's horns, the points are easy to define, but I'd be surprised if I asked anyone what the distance between them is and got a response that it's somehow obvious. And it would be even stranger for someone to say, well, that's obvious, I just need to go measure that distance with my ruler. I'd argue if you have to break out a ruler, the answer to my question wasn't obvious. There's at least a few explanations you could come up with where the answer to the distance question might be obvious without necessarily knowing the chest location, like that the blaze does not have a physical manifestation, but that might conflict with some other things Forrest has said. The distance could be 0, or the distance might not be fixed because the blaze or the chest can move. It could even have an observer effect where making a measurement changes the system. So even if you were to attempt to measure the distance between the blaze and the chest, the act of measuring might change the system and keep defeating the measurement. That's a pretty common phenomenon in quantum mechanics, but it happens in classical systems too. And there are a lot of questions in physics that would be obvious to physicists on paper because they have an understanding of the theory. In our case, maybe the question asked to Forrest is similarly obvious to him without taking the measurement because of the nature of the system that only he understands. But my point here is that there may be certain assumptions built into the question that shouldn't be. The last aspect I want to discuss by way of background are Forrest's quotes on how close people came to the chest. In 2017, during a Q&A, Forrest gave the following quote that addresses individuals being within 500 feet of the treasure, as well as 200 feet, where Forrest thinks the 200 feet is pretty accurate. In particular, he notes that there weren't very many people within 200, but lots of people within 500 feet. Some searchers have suggested that when Forrest uses the explicit term people, he means non-searchers, and only or mostly searchers have been at 200 feet. And I think this idea is hard to justify, since if you try to replace the word people with non-searchers in the first instance here, it doesn't make sense, because non-searchers don't tell Forrest Fenn where they were, which Eric Hall noted in one of his videos on his Blaze of Glory channel. I've never read a quote where Forrest indicated he was making a distinction, and this is from 2017, so it's one of the latest instances where he discusses 200 and 500 feet. So if he was trying to make a distinction, you have to argue he misspoke here in multiple places. So I think it's at least worth considering the possibility that Forrest is stating there are two places or paths where he can understand where specifically searchers have been and know how far they were from the chest. The interesting part to me is what Forrest is giving as his basis for knowing the distances. These are excerpts where Forrest is saying he's basing his knowledge on people telling him exactly where they were. Again, with another instance in the bottom left that you'd have to caveat if you'd want to argue that Forrest is using people to mean non-searchers. I've heard some searchers say they won't consider any final spots 200 feet or so from anything popular, somewhat based on the Fenny idea, and because they expect the 500-foot location to be highly trafficked and the 200-foot location to be low traffic, since that would directly correlate with the ratio described by Forrest. But it could also be the case that Forrest's knowledge is simply based on frequency of mention, meaning searchers might often be at both distances, but they only specifically mention to Forrest being at the 500-foot location for whatever reason. But if we can contrive a scenario where 200 feet is from a trafficked route, then we don't need to arbitrarily narrow our search areas. So let's say we have this arrangement where the chest is sitting around 200 feet from some path along with reference points X and Y in either direction. And then let's say there's a point of interest along that road or path that is somewhere within 500 feet away from the chest that people frequently mention to Forrest as having been there. Forrest would know you were at 200 feet if you did this and explicitly said you traveled from X to the point of interest along that path, but that's kind of a weird detail to include, and Forrest has noted that his information tends to be general, where he stated, "Searchers speak to me about their search places only in generalities." The more common scenario would be people writing to Forrest to say thank you and mentioning interesting places and sites they saw. So if this specific point of interest is on your list, but your overall email is general, for all Forrest knows, you came from direction Y, stopped, and turned around and left in direction Y, and you've only gotten on to the 500-footer list, even though you might have been at 200 feet depending on how you arrived there. The rarest case might be people who recognize the area's potential connection to the poem or a clue and included some detail that tipped Forrest off on what they did around that area, including maybe sending him a picture from the area along that path. And this would be consistent with an interview where Forrest appears to be discussing how he's aware of at least one instance of a 200-footer where he received a positive indication based on what seems to be a picture rather than Forrest guessing at where people have been. If you're not convinced this is a plausible arrangement, imagine if Forrest's approach were just to keep an active list of people who have been at their closest reported distance, and then imagine what Forrest would say if only one searcher were in the chase and they had only reported being at the point of interest with nothing more. So he can say they've been within 500 feet, but not necessarily 200 feet, so he has one 500-footer and no 200-footers. And then consider that more and more searchers join the chase, but where Forrest keeps getting that same type of generic email, and you still have no definitive 200-footers. If this were the arrangement and I were receiving these emails, I could say I know people have been within 500 feet, but I wouldn't say I know they've been within 200 feet unless I got verification. Again, I'm not saying this is what the quotes mean. I'm just providing a hypothetical arrangement so I can avoid giving an after-the-fact quote more weight than the poem itself. And the distance quotes seem like the most dangerous to interpret narrowly, especially if they arbitrarily limit your potential final spots to places 400 to 500 feet or so from roads or trails or something major. I also think this hypothetical arrangement would be consistent with this quote from the BBC.
There have been a few people within 500 feet. I think there have been people within a couple of hundred feet. They figure the first two clues, but they don't get the third and the fourth, and they go right past the treasure chest.
There's a lot about that section that's fascinating, including that it sounded to me like Forrest could have been winding up to say, but they don't get the third and the fourth, and they walk, but he stops himself and says, go right past instead if you listen again.
But they don't get the third and the fourth, and they go right past the treasure chest.
Either way, it's not exactly clear who he's describing there. It could be the 500-footers missed the third and the fourth clue, or it could be the people he thinks have been within a couple hundred feet. But regardless, it would at least be consistent to say people are reporting having been within 500 feet at the point of interest, and Forrest suspects that people have taken the path that takes them within a couple hundred feet, but he doesn't typically get that clarification, so that's why he only thinks there have been people within a couple hundred feet rather than claiming he knows it. And again, I'm not saying this is what the quotes necessarily mean. I'm just providing an example to avoid assuming the chest must be 500 feet or so from something well-trafficked. The main question in my hypothetical might be what sorts of paths could be involved, like a human hiking trail or potentially a road. If you read the third set of emails from the finder, he responded to Dale's statement that Forrest had told Dale he might have driven within 300 feet of the chest. The finder claims that Forrest rules this possibility out, since according to the finder, what Dale is describing is a man-made trail in close proximity. The quote that the finder seems to be referencing is this one from 2014, where Forrest actually said, "There isn't a human trail in very close proximity to where I hid the treasure." I think it's important to note that the finder is loosely implying that Forrest is on record ruling out close proximity, but Forrest is only on record ruling out very close proximity. And it might seem trivial, but imagine if you were hiking in an area with poor visibility from your level, but you see a local with a better vantage point, and you says to him, "Do you see a bear in close proximity to me?" And he responds that he doesn't see a bear in very close proximity to you. That's a pretty suspicious answer because the local is leaving a significant door open. Or to have it visually, let's say there's a smaller radius circle that we'll call very close proximity relative to the chest. And then there's a larger radius circle that we'll call close proximity. Forrest ruled out a man-made trail in very close proximity, so a road or path accessible to Dale's scooter running inside the larger circle would still be consistent with Forrest's words and Dale having driven in close proximity to the chest. So it's a question of definitions about the sizes of the two circles. If Forrest considers very close proximity to be 500 feet, then it's a little problematic to explain driving within 300 feet. But if Forrest considers very close proximity to be 100 feet, then it's not hard to imagine. Forrest was actually asked to address the terms close proximity and very close proximity, where the relevant part of the question is highlighted in blue, and Forrest explicitly declined to answer the question, highlighted in red, after noting that each close proximity is relative. So regarding whether it's possible for the chest to have been located within 300 feet of a man-made trail or even a road, I don't think Forrest's words are conclusive, and I don't think the finder has any motivation to be forthcoming. That's all of my background, and it's time for my specific approach. And again, I don't make any claims about the accuracy of any opinions, and when you catch me speaking as if this clue means this and Forrest meant that, it's just based on convenience of not having to caveat every sentence. The first thing that caught up in my mind after reading The Thrill of the Chase and studying the poem was the word bold, which appears as the last word of the second line of the treasure poem, and it reminded me of this poem that Forrest cites earlier in the book, having bold in the same position, second line, last word, and in a similar sounding phrase, since both are preceded by a two-syllable TR word. And if the word bold in the treasure poem sounded more organic, I don't know that this stands out as much, but it seems suspicious to me to have one poem mirror an earlier poem from the book. The first lines also seem to have a connection, since going alone somewhere might be hinting at courage, but one major aspect from the first poem that isn't explicit in the treasure poem is crimson. So I thought maybe Forrest was trying to hint at something crimson or red in the first and second line of his treasure poem. But then looking at the poem, if I'm expecting the second line to be a hint towards something red, you might expect the second to last line to have something useful in the same fashion, and I wouldn't be the first person to suggest that the second to last line might be hinting at something Native American, given the word brave. The other thing that stood out to me from the book is the same story that stands out to a lot of people, where Forrest describes his job as a dishwasher and uses variations of canyon and brown in close proximity, similar to the poem. So here's one of the maps I used. And the place that seemed most interesting was this section of Wyoming, where we've got something red in Red Canyon, something related to Native Americans that happens to be a national forest in Shoshone, and about as close as you can get to dishwashing in Sinks Canyon. But it could use improvement. It would be better if the Red Canyon were over Sinks Canyon, so we'd have a similar structure to the poem, red on top, Braven in the Wood on bottom, and the action might be occurring between those two. It's a bit more interesting from Google Earth, where you can see a pretty distinct iron-rich layer, and it runs from the spot labeled as Red Canyon on the map, which is by the arrow, and extends north below Lander. And Shoshone National Forest has a border that runs something like this, and sandwiched between them is Sinks Canyon. This is the wider view where you can see the iron-rich layer extends pretty far and is pretty noticeable. Here's the popular tourist site for Red Canyon and what's actually labeled on the map as Red Canyon. And here's a closer view of the iron-rich layer, but you can see that same feature on the road to Sinks Canyon just 1.5 miles away from the park entrance. And then Shoshone National Forest directly borders Sinks Canyon to the south. So here's my poem as a big picture using borders, a hint for Red Canyon Rim in the second line, and a hint for Shoshone National Forest in the second to last line, and the action of the poem should occur between them. And if you like finding further hints in the thrill of the chase, you can pretty much find whatever you want to support whatever location you want, but this section of looking for Lewis and Clark stood out to me since it has a lot of interesting aspects, like taking a hint, a Red Canyon, a national forest, and something being handy later on. And you can connect this story pretty easily to my map with Sacagawea, who traveled with Lewis and Clark and was Lemmy Shoshone. I think there are plenty of other reasons to arrive at Sinks Canyon, but using borders as hints would be a time saver of not having to investigate a lot of different places, especially if you had a comprehensive knowledge of features of the Rocky Mountains and thought these were hints. Those were hints I pulled from the book to apply to the poem, but there's one thing that I think might be a hint half contained in the poem, and it's the word it. I'm all about leaving the door open for possibilities, but I'd really like it if the word it is used consistently to refer to either the same thing or at least the same class of thing. It seems strange to me to introduce a pronoun without clear antecedent basis and then have the same pronoun refer to different things. The one exception would be the instance in blue, where it seems to be a rhetorical usage rather than a pronoun usage. But if we consider the fifth stanza, I don't know how many different things make sense to replace it here and have it be consistent with Forrest. The fifth stanza almost reads like he's talking about it as life, but that's a stretch to have fit in the earlier stanzas. It could be that Forrest is using it to mean a journey, where he's taken a journey and the searcher is too. But Forrest is also a lifelong fisherman, so I think having it be a river is something pretty specific that might make sense in the fifth and earlier stanzas. I suspect the clues are all in stanzas 2 through 4, but I would be surprised if the other stanzas didn't contain hints, and narrowing down it would be pretty useful. I will say, if you've never been to Sinks Canyon, it's worth a trip if you can make it, and if you do go, there's a really nice Airbnb near Lander that has 2 small Munsterlander dogs roaming the grounds. This is the second best picture I could get with a more energetic one named Marshall, and this was the best. And he might inspect your car if you leave your door open while unloading, but it was my favorite place I stayed, and it's pretty reasonable. Regarding the park itself, one interesting feature is that the Poposia River runs into a cavern called the Sinks. And here's a picture I took on the one day I went to the Sinks itself, where the river takes a sharp right turn and goes into this cavern and goes underground. From Google Earth, this is where the river goes underground and water flows underground and it comes back up at a place called the Rise. And for most of the year, there's no water above ground between them, but there is an overflow channel that can have water during spring runoff. And one thing to note here on a sign at the Sinks is that more water comes out at the Rise than goes in at the Sinks, which is kind of curious. But things don't get really fishy until it comes back up from underground at what's labeled a trout pool. Here's a view of the Rise with a visitor parking lot, and there's a path to an overlook where you can look down and see the trout. Here's the path to the overlook, and it has a place to buy fish food for a quarter to feed the trout. Here's the view down from the overlook. It's a pretty interesting place. The water is relatively still, so it's nice and quiet, and some of these trout are pretty hefty if you compare some of them, especially those chonkers in the bottom right corner relative to the smaller ones in the middle. And it's sort of mesmerizing to just watch them. And you can tell they're trout because of the way they are, so that's pretty neat. And here's the view down where you can see the pool is wide in parts and then narrows back as the pool ends, and you can see rocks poking above the surface. There are a couple signs on the overlook with descriptions of the place. And on this sign, it tells us that both brown and rainbow trout live at the Rise, and that the Rise acts as a barrier to any further upstream movement. And it also never freezes, which, if you've never been in Wyoming during winter, that's a pretty impressive feat for water that is relatively still. And one thing that may stand out to searchers specifically right away is this capital B on the word brown for brown trout, where the poem itself refers to a home of brown with a capital B. So why is this word capitalized for brown trout, but rainbow is not capitalized for rainbow trout? Nobody has ever accused me of being a genius, but even I know exactly why it's like this, and it's because I photoshopped it. It's lowercase on the sign. I'm of the opinion that a lowercase b on the sign is correct, and I've seen some people try to rationalize the ordinary capitalization of brown as it relates to trout by citing an article published in 2013 that sought to change standards for capitalization of common names, at least as they relate to American Fisheries Society's publications. That's a tough sell for me, though, since they are acknowledging that common names were not routinely capitalized, and they are proposing a change. But more importantly, Forrest published the poem and The Thrill of the Chase 3 years before a couple big shots got together to decide they wanted to change certain publication standards. Most other sources recognize that it's standard to lowercase an animal name unless it contains a proper name, like you would with Loch Leven trout, since Loch Leven is the name of a lake in Scotland. And I think this has been a fairly consistent standard between my Merriam-Webster dictionary from the 70s, where you can find an indication that both L's in Loch Leven trout are usually capitalized, but there's no such indication for brown trout. And both entries follow the same convention in the current online Merriam-Webster dictionary. You can also find the same convention in most publications, such as this publication from 1921 that discusses Yellowstone fish species where types of non-indigenous trout are listed, including rainbow, Lochlevin, and brown, and Lochlevin is the only one capitalized. And this is an example from the National Park Service website regarding trout, where it's the same convention. But for the poem, the most important aspect might be this one regarding whose rules Forrest was following when he wrote the poem, and whether his rules for capitalization would demand capitalizing brown as it relates to trout in an ordinary usage. And in one instance in Too Far to Walk, Forrest referred to Lochlevin trout and capitalized both L's, and he also referred to brown trout in an ordinary usage and lowercased it. So I'm not convinced that Forrest would capitalize brown in an ordinary usage if it were referring to trout. But anyway, you can find similar information on the fish food station, where brown and rainbow trout live in the rise. Brown is lowercase, as is ordinarily the case. The rise acts to prevent upstream movement, and it also notes that the fish are trying to go upstream to spawn, but they have to stop here. Before we get to clues, I wanted to discuss my thoughts on this place and Forrest. One good thing about not finding the treasure is that it gives you a lot of time to think. And I think the neatest part of the chase is this type of mentality that Forrest described relative to Osborne Russell. And just because I didn't find Forrest's special spot doesn't mean that Forrest has never been here or didn't eat a sandwich at the spot that I did. Or like how you make hiking more exciting by thinking, just because I don't see a mountain lion doesn't mean a mountain lion doesn't see me. So I think it's interesting to wonder how Forrest might have felt about different places. It may be an exercise that was bound to fail, for me at least, since I'll probably never truly understand Forrest given some of his experiences. I could hear or read his stories about his childhood and war, flying over a funeral and seeing terror in people's faces, being shot down and then pulled out, and all the rest. I could probably get to the point where I know all the words in his story and the meaning of each word and why it was used, and maybe even retell it myself, but there's a gap that language can't cover. I'll never be able to say I really understand what it was like to live through what Forrest did. Real understanding takes a certain level of shared experience to bridge the gap. Language itself can't get you all the way there. But the opposite can be true too, where if you have a strong enough shared experience, then you might not need much language, if any, to have an understanding. So when it comes to Forrest's life on a large scale and all he experienced, I can't say I have any real idea what it would be like to live his type of life and get to experience all he did, to the point where owning Sitting Bull's pipe, having a meaningful interaction with Jackie Kennedy, and owning alligators as pets can't even make the cut for a first memoir, and then out of nowhere get a cancer and think that's the end of it. Forrest does his best in the book, but he won't be able to fully cover that gap with language for me. And it's just hard for me to guess who would really feel like they truly understand Forrest's position when he thinks he's facing the end. Or more importantly, who Forrest might think could relate to his situation. Where maybe he feels like he's finally where he's supposed to be in life, but nature decides to change the rules. But if I'm tossing out guesses, how about this one trout that's staring at the top left corner of this shot? It's the one trout that has been consistently in frame the entire time I've been rambling, and he's been looking in the same direction, and that direction is where the river should be if it actually continued, but it doesn't. And isn't this the type of position that nature put Forrest in? What else does this trout know, really, except everything he's done has brought him up this river, and then nature, out of nowhere, says, "That's it. This is the end. What are you going to do about it?" And nature seemed to pose a similar question to Forrest, but if we learned anything from the Lorraine Mills interviews, it's that Forrest will answer rhetorical questions. And Forrest's answer on what to do in the face of a cancer was a poem containing 9 clues. The chase was one of the best things he felt he had left to leave, so he decided to put his chest out in the mountains for the benefit of future generations when he thought nature wasn't going to let him keep going. And this really isn't all that different from the trout here, considering their position. The best they have left is to reproduce and leave their offspring, and that's their trove they want to leave. This is the direction that one trout was staring, and seeing the trout do this type of thing is not uncommon if you watch for a little. The next couple pieces will be from this area. In this clip, this one trout seems like he's really intent and really trying to think it through. Other trout are moving in and out, looking in the same direction, but this one seemed more focused to me and gave it an extra look. And it's strange to think that it's not like it's each trout's first day here, but they still consistently look. And it might be because I've watched this clip so many times, but it's a little depressing when he decides he's looked enough for now. I'm obviously projecting, but it seems like they have a hard time accepting this is the end. But I think it would be hard to not feel some connection to these trout on a certain level if you felt like nature was telling you it's the end of your life and you weren't ready for it, or felt like there was more you wanted to do. For the poem, though, and in particular the 5th stanza, is this the mindset of a trout who has done the river tired and is forced by circumstance to stop here? And if they do spawn here, then it's probably after their best efforts convince them they aren't going to get a better answer. Or is it Forrest hinting at his life as a fisherman and trying to explain why he did this? You could convince me either way, but maybe it's both, that this stanza was really Forrest describing a connection to the place. This is where and why I would push back the most on appearances or surface level factors being critical to the spot. It might just be that there's only one particular place that Forrest felt spoke to him and to what he originally intended to do at that spot. And I don't think suicide is the right word for what Forrest planned at that spot. It's just that nature sometimes puts you in a position where taking a bunch of sleeping pills is the last available move you have to still feel like you're living your own life. If Forrest were going to die and decided to spend the end of his life in a hospital bed, he might have felt like he was abandoning his sense of self, something like the soul is dead that slumbers. Maybe it's better to dictate your own life and live through your last moments on your own terms, even if it means someone who doesn't understand might label you a suicide. I mean, a trout is never going to stop being a trout. They're never going to stop doing what trout do, and asking them to stop looking for a way upstream would be like asking them to just stop being a trout. It's easy to try and brush that off and say they don't know any better or they don't understand what they're doing, but I don't know if Forrest would say it like that. To him, it might be more like they refuse to do anything except be themselves, and that's the marvelous thing about animals. They're so dedicated to being themselves. So Forrest's spot might just be a symbol of his respect for being yourself no matter what, and trying to do the best you can with whatever you have. If that's the case, maybe Forrest didn't have a choice on where that symbol occurred for him. In terms of how Forrest might have ever interacted with this place, it's hard to say. Maybe the Fenn family stopped here on the way to Yellowstone one summer before it became a state park, so Forrest could catch his first brown trout. So maybe it's a place he knew about from when he was younger. But for me, I wondered if this place took on a special meaning after one particular phone call in view of this piece from the Moby Dickens recording that Toby has permitted me to share.
My father had pancreas cancer. They gave him 6 months to live. 18 months later, he was still fishing up in Yellowstone in those lakes and fast streams. But one night, about 10 o'clock at night, he said, call me on the phone. I was in Santa Fe and he was in Temple, Texas. He said, Forrest, I just want you to know that I'm getting ready to take 50 sleeping pills. And I said, Dad, I'll be there first thing in the morning. I had an airplane. He said, that's too late. And it was too late. But I respected him because he wanted to do things on his own terms. What's wrong with making your own rules about things? He could have gone in the hospital and withered away for another 3 weeks or a month. That's no way to live. And all of these thoughts manifest themselves in my treasure chest. The thrill of the chase. I keep going back to the thrill of the chase.
I've thought about that last phone call a lot, and I can't imagine there wasn't more to that call, and I've wondered what Forrest's dad would think he should say, and whether he thought he needed a metaphor to explain to Forrest what he was going to do. If they had been here, I think this place might do pretty well to explain that the only test that really matters, or the only one worth passing, is if you can live your life the way you think you should, all the way to the end, in spite of nature's indifference. And then, a year later, after that last phone call, when Forrest learns he has a cancer and finds himself in a similar situation, there might have been one specific place on Forrest's mind. But of course, maybe mountain lions have been closer to this place than Forrest Fenn ever was. That's the funny part of the chase to me. Either way, I doubt he would have placed the chest on the overlook, but this was my starting point. We know that the rise doesn't freeze, which might be a giveaway that something is going on with temperature, and geologists have done studies to suggest that the water being mixed with the river is 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And to clarify, that's not the temperature of the rise itself, but the temperature of the additional source of water if we assume there's only one additional source with a uniform temperature. The temperature of the rise is closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but still close enough for me to say they are warm. The first clue in my approach is begin at where warm waters halt, and the location of my first clue is the furthest the trout can go upstream before their progress is halted. It's the warm waters halting the upstream movement of the trout. And in my approach, the word "it" is a river, so if we read the pronoun in, it would mean begin the river where warm waters halt. And then waters is being used as the subject of a phrase, and the object is something else that's not explicitly stated. And in my case, the object is the trout or their migration. That might be good enough for some people to say, okay, warm waters are coming from underground. The trout want to keep going upstream, but they get to the warm waters and their progress is halted. But if you're from Missouri, you might want me to show you a trout being halted by warm waters. So let's take a look at a place where we can see the water coming up from underground and rippling the surface. In this video, this trout is doing the usual, where it seems like he's giving it a good look, trying to figure out exactly what's going on here. And the water is moving from that direction, so surely that's where he's meant to go. So he thinks about it for a little and decides to take a closer look. And so far, so good, but he gets to a spot and stops. It doesn't seem like he ran out of depth there, since he's still casting a shadow away from his body, but he drifts back and looks a bit more and eventually decided to go on to other things. The best way to show an abrupt stop might be to speed it up, where in this version you can see that the trout's nose pitches down and to the left, down and to the left, down and to the left. To start mapping it out, this is the location of my first clue, and now we need to look for what I think is the second clue, and take it in the canyon down, or by reading in the pronoun and take the river in the canyon down. I think this is standard opening theory for Sinks Canyon to say it's a play on the name and cite Forrest's rearrangements of Flutterby, Butterfly, and I think it's a decent argument to say the second clue is naming the canyon. I rarely went on the blogs or Facebook, but I at least know A Gypsy's Kiss had this idea when they came to Sinks Canyon. This also might be what the little girl in India would be able to read on a map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains. It was at least on my map of the U.S. Rocky Mountains. She could also point to the first clue where the river begins above ground again if she had a resolved enough map, but like I said, I'm suspicious of how reliable the little girl in India actually is. Regardless of an attempt to name the canyon, I think it also gives us a direction to take the river, both down in terms of elevation, which is north, and down in terms of river flow. Or if you want to consider the warm waters to be taking the river, how Troy at Why Must I Go argues grammatically, it's the same direction. And in general, I'm going to refer to this direction as north if I have to. It's not precisely north, but I just need a way to reference direction. On to clue 3, which I think is not far, but too far to walk, or how I read it, how far we need to take the river in the canyon down. For this clue, I want to go back to a sign that notes that the pool is deep. And if you can't tell from any of the pictures, it gets deep enough where you couldn't stand with your feet on the bottom. Even this beginning section drops off pretty quickly. But as you go further down, you can tell from the shading how it drops off again. And if you watch the educational video, it gets to be over 20 feet deep. So if you either consider the warm waters to be taking the river, or if I'm being asked to take a river a certain distance and the river gets to be 20 feet deep, you can definitely have a relatively short travel distance that's not feasible to walk, and where dependence on river depth is probably going to be a pretty big stumbling block for the little girl in India, regardless of whatever map she has. I think this idea is consistent with the preface of Too Far to Walk, where Forrest discusses walking in the river and then refers to the journey being too far to walk. In this context, walking didn't mean having your feet dry along the bank. Forrest used walk in the preface to mean traversing the river distance with his feet on the bottom. So if I were the lexicographer for the Forrest Fenn dictionary, I'd include this concept as one of several possible usages for walk. I was also very interested in this section of Cynthia Meacham's book, where she was discussing an approach with Forrest where the distance between her warm waters halt and the put-in, as I understand it, is 10 miles or so along the Rio Grande. In response, Forrest stated that he would have said not far but too far to swim. And we don't have the full context here or what exactly was said, but this is interesting since Forrest seems to be implying that if Cynthia's approach were correct, the clue would have addressed traversing that section of water in the water, even though Cynthia wasn't in the water and wouldn't be required to be in the water, which is the same situation here. I don't need to be in the rise, but the distance is dependent on how you would traverse the rise. 10 miles along any waterway would likely be too far to swim for most people, but the length of the pool is less than 500 feet, so people could swim that, but it would only be walkable if the river were shallow enough. To be fair, though, it's also possible that Forrest responded this way because the clue doesn't involve water at all, so this quote really only narrows down what we are taking to either water or not water. My point here is that on the surface, this statement seems like the strongest challenge to using a water-based distance, but I don't think it actually excludes it. I think the most compelling evidence that the distance of not far but too far to walk is not some long distance like 10 miles is from this exchange with Lorraine Mills.
Now, you say that you're writing a sequel.
I'm writing a book called Too Far to Walk.
Isn't that a line from the poem?
No.
No.
But it's the theory. It is a line from the poem, as a matter of fact, yeah.
Lorraine knew the poem well enough to recognize the phrase, and I'm not sure what Forrest would have been thinking for that split second before he corrected himself to acknowledge it is in the poem. It's possible that Forrest's mind worked by knowing his blueprint and the language was academic, so maybe for a split second he got caught off guard and didn't recall the precise language he used, and that's why he immediately deflected. But either way, I think there's something a little deeper than just some arbitrary distance that people would judge and say, oh, I wouldn't feel like walking that far, we should drive. My guess was that Forrest knew the blueprint requires a different way of judging distance and that's the theory he knew was underpinning a piece of the poem, despite not being certain about the language for a split second. To apply that idea to my blueprints so far, not far but too far to walk is referring to the length of the trout pool, or the section of the river that is too deep to walk. And next, we are looking for a place to put in below the home of Brown. And the signs at the overlook tell us that the rise is a home for trout, and we know that brown trout live here. That meant I treated the home of Brown as the trout pool itself, and Brown is a reference to the trout that live in the rise, including brown trout. If that doesn't sound right, we can come back to it, but it just so happens that where the pool comes to an end, there's a second place to park. So I interpreted the put in to mean where Forrest wants you to park. Or if we consider we are taking something in the canyon down, with down being a direction, the visitor parking lot would be above the home of Brown, but the second parking lot would be below the home of Brown in a relative sense. And when we go to that second parking lot below the home of Brown, we find everyone's favorite thing to find at a parking lot, a nice wooden sign similar to the wooden sign where Forrest's dad went in. There are actually a bunch of signs telling us not to park here, where the smaller ones in orange are relatively new if you check Google Street View, and the wooden one in green is older. But parking somewhere that might draw attention could make some sense of this quote, suggesting that it would be best to have a search partner wait in the car, like if the superintendent shows up and says to move. And some searchers have naturally wondered if this would make searching less safe, but there's a pretty obvious solution to this issue, and it's just to search alone like I did. I know that some searchers think that you must literally step on each clue, and there's no other way to physically get to the final spot based on this quote, where Forrest stated, "There is no other way to my knowledge." My initial reaction to reading this the first time was that Forrest was saying, if you want to know what he knows, which is where the chest is, you should follow the clues, especially since Forrest declined to answer the question as stated. Regardless, I think Forrest's answer is generic to the common reading and to my reading. It also depends on what Forrest means by followed. Does that mean you are literally stepping on each clue, or just that you're aware of what the clues are? I think it's a push, at least in view of this quote where Forrest referred to a potential finder following the clues, at least in their mind. And my approach was to follow the clues wherever they lead, even if they might run counter to a common reading of certain quotes. This parking place is the closest to my final location, but I always parked down the road by Sawmill Campground, partly because it's less depressing to walk downhill at the end of a day, but knowing you're meant to park here is important to at least one of my later clues. And regarding a later clue for which parking there is important, next we get to my 9th favorite clue. From there, it's no place for the meek. And the reason it's my 9th favorite is that it really seems like it needs the most active catalyst from the book. The story in the book is No Place for Biddies, where the title of the chapter mirrors the poem language. In the story, Forrest discusses two biddies saying he would run away from home, but he's not allowed to cross the street, and he didn't say anything out loud. if we apply this idea directly, you might say no place for the meek would correspond to crossing the road. For the clue itself, it would read like, from there, the river is crossing the road, after we fill in the pronoun, like here. A better reading based on the book might be to read the contraction its as it has, which was Christy Meep's idea from the March Calazars Marathon. I'm guessing she was testing that approach to backdoor a definition of it by reading it as, from there, it has no place for the meek, and then considering what sorts of things can have a place for the meek, or in my case, the river has a way to cross it. Either one is tough for me, since I don't think an average person would come up with that answer without the book. And the way I can get it to make sense in the absence of the book is to consider what actually happens as you progress from the put-in to the bridge, in that it gets progressively louder. You can see from this view that the water gets rougher and rougher closer to the bridge, and that's how it feels walking to the bridge away from the relatively still water of the pool, where it gets louder and louder, and the loudest place is when you actually cross it, which would be no place for someone timid or soft-spoken. So apart from what appears to be a blatant hint in the book, it seems like "so hear me all and listen good" might be hinting towards some auditory aspect to a clue. The river was pretty low each time I was there, and you can compare this picture, and in particular the base of this tree, to the same tree on Street View where the water is running a lot higher. I won't blow out your ears to make a point, and I'm sure it's more dramatic in the warmer months, but just given how close the canyon walls are to the bridge, it's still noticeably loud relative to the overlook. And in terms of safety, this isn't something that's convenient to cross any other way. I mean, I could do it at this time of the year in chest-high waders, but you can forget about it in the spring. Next up is "the end is ever drawing nigh." And there's a few different ways to read this clue, and they all have the same general outcome. The first would be to interpret "the end" to mean the end of the chase, and "nigh" to mean near, and that we should be getting closer to the end. This might imply that we haven't been consistently doing that up to this point, or that we've been moving away from the end. In general, I think there's something a little more significant to this clue in view of the word "ever," which tends to mean always or continually. Imagine if your favorite fairy tale were amended to replace "and they lived happily ever after" with "and they lived happily after." It sounds kind of ominous because of the implication. For our case, if the clues followed a straight shot from clue 1 to the chest, and you interpret "nigh" to mean near, I think you should put a clue stating that the end is ever drawing nigh at the beginning, since that's when it applies. You are continually getting closer to the end from the outset. But in our case, Forrest put the clue in the middle, which, if the path is not a straight shot, you could say the end is drawing nigh up to a certain point, but you'd need to put the end is ever drawing nigh later if you have to increase your distance to the chest before you close it again. In this approach, if this is our general path, we might expect that we aren't meant to continue in that direction. The other way to read "the end" would be as a synonym of "halt," which generally has the same effect, where we are meant to start heading back to where warm waters halt. And another way to interpret "nigh" is to mean on the left, which is where we are going, meaning once we have safely crossed the river at no place for the meek, we are meant to turn left. And there's one more possible interpretation, but I think it'll be easier to see when we go looking for the blaze. But now we get to my favorite clue, which I consider to be these two lines together. It seems like some searchers interpreted the first half to mean that you won't be able to paddle up your creek, in which case paddle would be a verb. But would it make sense for the answer to that idea in question form to be no, just heavy loads and water high? You'd expect that type of answer if you asked the question, will there be any paddles up my creek, in which case paddle in the poem should sound like a noun. Or envision if Forrest would just read the entire two lines in response to the questions. It makes sense if the question involves paddle as a noun, but not as a verb. It's a poem, so anything goes, but I just prefer having it be a noun. Of course, you could just as easily say, well, but Fergus, you're formerly at a river, not a creek, and Forrest would never bend a word like that or label something with the wrong name. Maybe it's a reasonable criticism, but keep in mind that the mayor of Lander may or may not have received a petition to have this section of the Paposia renamed the Little Popo Aggie Creek, so I think we're going to be okay here. The main reason I like this clue a lot is that there's a pretty definable object up this waterway where all three aspects apply to the same object. So if someone were going to ask questions about it, and the first question was, will there be a paddle up your creek, like from people fishing in boats? The easy answer is no. There are signs all over the place, including by the bridge, that says you better not be fishing up there. It's also posted on the fish food station and on some more signs around the rise itself. If you like paddle as a verb, it would certainly fit as a verb here, but I think this addresses the fact that no one is going to have a boat up at the rise with a paddle trying to fish, and certainly no one is going to be arriving there from upstream with a paddle. But mostly, I like the no paddle aspect because the rise is a place where conceivably there could be a paddle, but there won't be, as opposed to having the waterway lead to something like a waterfall where there's probably not a reason a paddle would be up that waterway anyway. For the heavy loads, we can go back to our important literature, which tells us about these chunky fish who get pretty hefty and have plenty of food. In my approach, the heavy loads would be all these trout that just hang out and wait to be fed, like this one about to swallow a pellet. I promise that pellet is not photoshopped in there, but anyway, the term loading is a fly fishing term, so I think it's a pretty decent fit. And then for the water high, in the same way that canyon down seems to be a play on sinks being a direction, high seems to be a play on water that has risen up from underground. This approach could also resolve the problem of waters versus water in the poem. What's the rationale of making it plural in one case and singular in the other? I've heard Forrest refer to the first clue and say, warm water halts, so I don't know that it was a critical consideration for him, but if you consider that there are multiple sources of water from underground, from the river itself, and at least one additional source of warmer temperature water, but then once it's above ground, the water is named in the singular as the rise, it might make sense of this issue. We're going off the beaten path now, but there's an animal trail that runs from the bridge up to the rise along this general route. And if you can't hike this, you probably can't hike very many places. For the most part, it's just a flat walk up to the rise following the animal trail, and the only difficult part is making sure not to step in things. The next line of the poem is, "If you've been wise and found the blaze," but before we go looking for the blaze, I wanted to show an interesting spot. Here's the approach back to the rise, and we can see the calm area of the pool, and there's a pretty clear line where it gets shallow and the water starts to ripple. And the next video I'm going to show is standing right about here. For reference, here's our wooden sign, and there's a pretty distinctive cutout with a sandy bottom where if you had to say where the pool begins, it's right here, since the water starts to ripple like a foot or two later. So let's see what we find in this spot. Pretty interesting, I think, just trout hanging out. Here's another closer look, and in case some are blending into the edges, I take a look at the one in blue where he doesn't really move at all. The other ones fidget a little, but at least this one might as well be sleeping. I've spent more time than I care to admit watching trout hang out here on my various trips, but I always found them here, and I think it's a pretty neat spot where you can see the trout up close. The best lighting tends to be on overcast days, so there's not a ton of glare, and you can get a good look since there's a pretty shallow shelf all around the end of the pool. But back to the chase. In order to find the blaze and use it, I think it's helpful to go back to the book for a couple things to add to our potential toolbox. The first one is this story about Frosty becoming a ruler, where it's capitalized in one instance but not the other, and it seems like it's a stretch to capitalize, so I put a ruler in my toolbox. The other thing that stands out to most searchers is the issue of the omegas at the end of the book, and there are some other curious capitalizations referring to different people turning alpha or being alpha, which seem like even more of a stretch than capitalizing ruler. So it seemed like maybe there was something going on with Greek letters or alpha hinting towards omega, so I tossed some Greek letters in my toolbox. I'm guessing most people who would make it this far into a treasure video probably recognize this scene from National Treasure. Boromir is trying to figure out a clue where a word is capitalized and it normally wouldn't be. He asks his henchmen why, and they respond with, because it's important. That's still an accurate answer, and maybe that's the generic answer to why Forrest did those things in his book, to have some subtle hints stand out and make them seem important. When it came to the poem, though, I was personally in tight focus with the word wise, regarding why you need to be wise in order to find the blaze. Wisdom tends to be gained from past experiences or learning from what's already been experienced. So for my approach, the blaze is, in a word, brown. It's the trout that live in the rise. Forrest deliberately made brown stand out in the poem by capitalizing it when it normally wouldn't be. I think this is consistent with a lot of what Forrest has said, including this answer that a blaze is anything that stands out. So if you were building a poem and you referred to the blaze, it would be great to be able to say there's only one blaze. There's only one thing in the poem that stands out, and it's the capitalized word that doesn't have a clear explanation for why it was capitalized. And I think if Forrest had come up with a way to hide the blaze in plain sight, a lot of people might say, why didn't I think of that, to somewhat validate this quote from 2015 where Forrest suggests that will be the reaction. It also seemed suspiciously convenient that there would just happen to be an object at Forrest's special place that could serve as a generic blaze, and that happened to be directly over a place to put the chest and potentially his bones. It's possible that Forrest physically built something at the spot, but it's not an issue if the architect of the poem can just define whatever he wants to be the blaze and define direction using the features of the place. This also solves an additional problem of how do you have a blaze to attract a searcher but not a filthy casual just out hiking? And you do it by definition. The blaze is only a blaze to a Fenn searcher. I think it also resolves the problem of having to refer to the book or wander aimlessly around, checking everything you see that looks interesting, wondering if it might be a blaze. This quote isn't precise enough to rule out using the book at all, but having the blaze in the poem makes it a lot easier for me to envision someone finding it with just the poem. So let's piece this together with some of our tools by drawing out our journey so far with just a skosh of artistic license. We know where warm waters halt, and we can nail that down. And after following the river, we put in below the home of Brown, went north to the bridge, no place for the meek, to get on the opposite side of the Paposia, and made a big left-handed turn to come back up to the rise, and now we found the blaze. Then we should be looking quickly down. A common usage of the word down might suggest a drop vertical, but quickly is a bit odd if that's the case. If it really were a drop vertical and the poem said, look slowly down, I think everyone is going to look underneath any hypothetical blaze, whether it's said slowly down or quickly down, and even just look down would have the same effect. We've already had one instance of the word down in Canyon Down that wasn't a drop vertical, but for this one, Forrest would need to give us some way to reference direction, and if he were going to do it that way, he ought to give you the reference right after the word down. So this is my reference for down, your quest to cease, or call it my ruler. For our quest, most people might say they seek the chest, but the poem tells us we need to find the blaze, and that's what we've just found at this point. But this is another reason I like a layered meaning to the fifth stanza. My trove for all to seek in Forrest's voice is the chest, but in the voice of a trout from a previous generation, the trove for all to seek is its offspring, and that's what we're seeking as the blaze. So I don't think it's too much of a bend to say if someone thinks they've found the blaze, they'll feel like that was the quest because that's what everyone wants to see or find. As for cease, that one's a bit easier, and I wouldn't be the first to note that cease and halt are synonyms. But I think you could also read it as constructing a ruler from where you encounter the blaze to where it halts or ceases, which is at where warm waters halt. All right, back to the drawing board. And this is where my video is time-stamped for people who wanted to skip ahead. So let's go through the clues. We're at the rise of the Paposia in Sinks Canyon. Warm water is coming from underground, halt the trout trying to go upstream. We take the river in the canyon down in elevation and water flow, also potentially naming Sinks Canyon. and the distance we follow it being the river, is not far but too far to walk in the fisherman's sense of the word, since the pool gets to be 20 feet deep and is too deep to walk. We put in below the home of Brown, which is a reference to the trout that live there, despite the fact that Brown would ordinarily be lowercased for brown trout and is lowercased on all the signs at the rise. We go north to where the river crosses the road, no place for the meek given how loud it is, making a big left-handed turn to come back up to the rise, where, prior to no place for the meek, we had been moving away from the final location, but now it will be continually drawing near or ever drawing nigh. The rise itself, which is up this waterway, has no paddle from boats or fishermen, just heavy loads, the chunky fish that get fed by tourists, and water high playing on the name of the rise. And now we've found where the trout hang out, which is the blaze, because Brown is capitalized when it normally wouldn't be and therefore stands out. The blaze is our quest, since that's what we've been looking for, and Warm Water's halt is the cease, and now we have a way to reference down, and it points us in a direction to finish off a general omega path. That's how I read the clue involving the blaze. Look down relative to a line drawn between the blaze, your quest, and where Warm Waters halt. But now, quickly is serving a critical function, since you can imagine that the trout might be found anywhere along the length of the pool, but it's important to look down at the first place you see them, our little cutout. If you want to jump ahead to see where I think that arrow points and the object that controls the geography here, skip ahead until you see Tom Hanks, since the next bit is just about the blueprint structure. But I will say that I think it points into a spot that has an entrance maybe 3 or 4 feet wide, so on the scale of things, the word quickly is not trivial. As a general concept, I think this type of approach has a lot going for it. For starters, it's consistent with Forrest's statement that he felt like an architect drawing the poem. If the solve gets released, I'll be very surprised if it's A to B, B to C down the list, and there's no connection between the first and later clues. But in this approach, it's structured and the clues work together to draw where to go. It's also consistent with Forrest actually referring to a blueprint. I think it's simple enough where just having a blueprint like this in hand would probably cut some time off the chase if my spot had been correct, and I think if you drew in a couple features like this, I think a searcher shows up within 12 feet of my final clue relatively quickly, or add another random label to point out water high, or draw a bridge for no place for the meek to keep making things more explicit. I think if you gave someone this blueprint on a post-it note and the name of the canyon, the rate limiting step to getting within 12 feet is probably traveling to Sinks Canyon. Also, like a good architect, there might be some structural redundancies built into it such that it won't fail if you have the bare bones of it, but the more you have, the more stable it is. The first thing that I think works to reinforce this approach is the word wise. I like it to suggest that you should have noticed that the word brown stands out, but it could also be interpreted to serve this purpose where your path from the put-in is roughly in line with where you were meant to look down. And this is the rationale of wanting you to park there or know you're meant to park there to visualize the situation. Forrest starts his book by saying he'll use words however he likes, and has stated if you know what he means, who cares what the word is. The word wise is in the dictionary as it relates to knowledge or understanding, but it's also in there as a suffix related to direction, such as counterclockwise. And if you were imagining your path should be tracing a rough omega, and someone said, "Have you been wise yet?" it wouldn't be hard to understand what they mean. Another structural redundancy might be the end, and I discussed various interpretations where now the final one would be that it's referring to an omega, the end of the Greek alphabet that curves left on our journey. Of course, in the first Medium article, the finder stated his confusion on how the omegas could have been a hint, since they also appeared in $17 a square inch, which was published in 2007. I thought that comment was sarcastic when I first read it, since Forrest stated he spent 15 years on the poem. So if he got cancer in 1988, depending on when he started the poem and whether he took extended breaks, he would have either had it completed by 2007 or been at least 11 or 12 years deep by 2007 in order to publish it in 2010. It's hard to know how precise this 15-year figure is, but as long as he had been making plans or working on the poem prior to 2007, I don't see a proper justification to exclude anything as a per se rule. In general, I wouldn't be surprised if Forrest knew all along how he was going to get someone to the final location, but getting the wording right took some off and on effort over the years. And if an omega could be used as a shorthand to the blueprint or have some other relation to the chase, I might consider putting that symbol in the Tales of Beetle the Bard 2 if I weren't sure how the chase would eventually take form. I'm not trying to debate the finder on the specifics of what's relevant, okay? I'm not going to sit here and debate, but for the community going forward trying to work out the correct approach, I think it's strange to rule out pre-thrill of the chase subject matter, especially when the finder stated he didn't even bother to ask Forrest about the omegas after finding the treasure. But let's just say you didn't know anything about an omega. I think it's sufficient to read that clue as a change in direction where, after that point, you should be continually getting closer to the chest. I thought Forrest might have been trying to use stanzas 1 and 5 to hint towards something coming back in line, given that they sort of match up line for line in themes or balance. Either way, let's just say you aren't visualizing anything like that. Nothing really changes as long as you follow the clues in their simplest forms to get on the opposite side of the Paposia and come back to the rise. But one of the things we can't lose, one thing that's indispensable, is where warm waters halt, the first clue, because if we lose that, we lose our ruler and we lose down. So Forrest could start off and show you a blaze. He could have taken you all around the Rockies and shown you a million of mine. It would probably be an awesome vacation, but you're not finding the treasure chest without knowing where warm waters halt and following the clues to arrive at the blaze. An extreme dependence on the first clue shouldn't really come as too much of a surprise, though. Focusing on the first clue is the one consistent theme in Forrest's quotes over the years. Feel free to pause the video and read some examples, but I think this approach addresses the importance of the first clue. Maybe the first videos convinced you that the trout makes sense as a blaze, but if you're from Missouri, you might be saying that I just happened to show up on the one day where the trout were having a party at that cutout. But from my experience, the trout love hanging out here, and in particular, you'll find the first one in a certain window where we can use this rock as a reference point and call it A, and use these two as two more points of reference and call them B and C. And the line between B and C and the parallel line intersecting the A rock form a window that will help us analyze down. So if we look at this video again, you can see that all the ones we can see, and especially the first ones, are in this window. This video is from my favorite spot on a different day, and I think it's useful in demonstrating how much these trout love this spot. Here's our reference rocks and the window. The main drama we're going to watch is between this one trout, let's call him John Charles whatever for convenience, where he's sitting in the real prime real estate, and another smaller trout, let's call him Little Forrest. As we start the video, Little Forrest is hanging out further up, and he's going to try and mosey in there, and John Charles gets annoyed right away and tells Forrest he can't sit there. So, alright, strike one. But this is my experience, having spent more than a few hours watching them from this vantage point. The trout really seem to love that central spot. But back to the drama. Little Forrest is going to give it another try. This time he's going to try and slip in front of John Charles, but John Charles doesn't like that because he's probably blocking his view or whatever, and he chases him right out of there. Alright, now Little Forrest is going to have himself a cry near the A rock and talk himself back up, and he comes back around for one more shot, but John Charles sees him right away and turns his head to look at Little Forrest, and Little Forrest says, "Fine, forget it, I'll just sit here." And he settles back in where he started. And that was 6 minutes of drama condensed down. But what I'm trying to show is that this little central area right before the river picks up seems to be a prime location for the trout, and they always seem to want to be there. One other interesting thing about this video is what happens with one particular trout at the very extreme edge of the cutout, where he has to swim to constantly stay where he is. The prime spot seems to be where John Charles is, but for this one he's having a hard time sitting still like John Charles. So this clip is showing between the B and C rock is as far back as you'll find one, since any further downstream, given the depth and the current, they really can't maintain that position. Regarding the trout being there, I'm not sure the poem fails even if you had arrived and the trout refused to be there. And in this picture, it's hard to make out all of them from this distance, but there's at least 3 here, but let's just pretend they aren't there. The edge of the pool is pretty easy to define, and it comes back to a narrow section. So if we're looking at the poem for a different way to define the blaze, and we interpret blaze to mean something that is guiding the path, I think it can be said that each clue so far has involved the pool in some fashion given certain interpretations. The toughest one is "from there, it's no place for the meek," where you'd have to interpret "from there" to be a reference to where you parked near the end of the pool, which is another reason it's my 9th favorite clue. But you would have a push-pull type effect of "from there" and "up your creek" in clues 5 and 7 referring to the rise. And then you can still construct a ruler that intersects the end of the pool to where warm waters halt and look down, and whether you use the extreme edge of the pool if the trout have conspired against you, or in this case, the first actual trout, it's still a line being drawn from our window, and as we'll see, it gets you into the same spot. You could even argue that you're constructing a ruler from end to end of the pool. I don't really like this approach of having the pool be the blaze, since I think it leaves the capital B of brown hanging, but as a failsafe, it's not the worst. Now, let's look quickly down. Here is where we found the blaze in my approach. Just from being there, I can tell you that this is roughly the cutout, but Google Earth doesn't show the trout, but they should be right about here. The biggest obstacle is this massive rock. It may not look like much, but if you compare it to the cars, it's pretty impressive. It's something like 30 plus feet across left to right here, and it does a pretty good job separating the north and south sides since it sticks out into the water, and especially since going around this way is not practical, as we'll see. If we rough in our ruler, the real question is which side of the rock is down relative to our ruler. The rule of thumb would be your line of sight shouldn't intersect the long axis of the rock if you want the line dropped off the ruler to be square. This picture was taken from the north side where the large rock is to our right and we are looking across the end of the pool, and for reference, this is the wooden parking sign, and down in order to point here would be roughly in line with that sign. So whether you use the extreme edge of the pool or the first trout, which is in the shadows of this picture, it's about the same. And if we plot these points from the aerial view, this is where the picture was taken, and here's the wooden sign. So if that's meant to be the down line, it's a bit cattywampus, and it's pretty easy to sense this angle is not right when you're on the ground. It would look better if down lined up like this, and now down points to the south side of the large rock. This is the view from the south side of the large rock where we are about as close as we can get to it and still see out. Looking across, you can see one of the newer no parking signs near the northern end of the parking lot, and we can see the shading of the end of the pool. We can also see our reference rocks and our window. Now, if our ruler is running like this, whether you use the extreme edge of the pool or the first trout, it points you down into the same spot on the south side of the large rock. Of course, the simpler way is if you knew you were expected to trace an omega, you might be wondering what makes us have to do this, and in this case, it's the rock that forces you to go into the water a bit and then make a sharp right turn. I thought there might have been a hint from the book to tell us that this rock should be part of our decision on how to look down, rather than thinking the chest is in the water under the trout or something else, considering that this is the key decision to make, meaning which side of the rock is the downside. This is from Star Wars, but I think everyone knows the similar story in The Thrill of the Chase, where Forrest describes closing his left fist, sticking out his thumb and bringing it close to his eye. He ends up covering Philadelphia. I think it's pretty common to suspect this story might mean something to the chase. It stood out to me because I still don't understand why the story was in there, and the grave marker was so good on its own, I didn't think this added anything significant. But anyway, what do you think this rock is going to look like? If you had your choice on what this rock should look like, I mean, besides a frog and besides Jackie Kennedy, something with a thumb would be nice, and it'd be better if it looked left-handed, like how Tom Hanks' left hand is arranged. So let's see. I mean, it's not bad. I'm still waiting on the results of my Freedom of Information request to see how this rock got here, but it does a pretty good job of isolating these two possible places for down. You can contort it in your mind to resemble a right hand if you consider the fist to be punching the ground, but I think it looks nice as being left-handed where the wrist would be down and the thumb points left. You can tell better from the put-in how that seam segments the rock. This is that same seam, and the thumb protrusion is here where the backside of your palm should be. It does some other curious things, like on the way up to the rise you can see the tourist overlook, and as you come down to the water, the overlook goes behind it. I did my due diligence here with gypsy magic, but my biggest objection is that the words of the poem don't seem to fit this approach. I'm not a poem purist, but having this be the correct way to interpret the poem seems like it would be way too dependent on the book. I can at least justify using a ruler or line to reference down in view of the word quickly, suggesting a non-vertical drop down, and you don't necessarily need to see an omega, and it doesn't really matter what this rock looks like, but this one would be tough for me. Even trying to reverse engineer it to fit the words of the poem, I think it's way too complicated, and it's hard to get a sense of scale from pictures, but it doesn't really pin it down to a precise spot. A hint from the poem that the south side of the rock is down might be in the final stanza that says, "Your effort will be worth the cold." By the time the water gets to here, it's pretty cold, and the water is generally cold around the edges since the water stagnates here. So the cold is this small section of water you have to go into in order to get around this rock. Even at the high water mark, it's pretty safe of a water entry. Granted, this is as low as it gets, and I could do this in 10-inch boot covers, but I'm guessing it's knee or thigh high at worst, and there's plenty of space to walk safely between the shallow section and the pool itself, which is outlined roughly in red. And I also did a video on this line of the poem a while back if you check my channel. So let's see what this spot has to offer in potential hiding spots. In this video, we're on the south side of the rock, and here's our B and C rocks, and down should be like this. So let's see what we've got. It's a pretty sweet spot, and you know you picked a weird hobby when the obvious question is, I wonder if you could hide a body in there. I was able to shimmy to the point where I could sit completely inside the alcove where nobody passing by anywhere could see me unless they were directly in front of the alcove. So I'm sure Forrest could lay down here if it was the last thing he did. Here's the problem. It's against the park rules to use a metal detector, but fortunately I had this neat stick, and don't ask me how it works, but it can detect stories, and generally if large amounts of artifacts are concentrated in one spot, there's a story attached to it. So it's almost like a metal detector, but it's not a metal detector because that would be against the rules. So when I refer to using gypsy magic, I'm only referring to using this stick to detect stories, and I'm very confident it was not hidden in this alcove, at least as of November 2019, which was the first time I was in possession of gypsy magic, and I'm basing that on this stick and only this stick. In hindsight, though, I think this alcove would have been an odd place to hide or bury it, because it's the obvious place for it. It's tough to wander into this spot, but nobody is not looking in the alcove if they did. In terms of what else this spot has to offer, this is the view from the put-in, and we drew the line down between the two boulders. The alcove is here, and there's not a good way to go up and out. Here's a view from the high side and the direction into the spot. And I promise you, if your favorite 80-year-old started walking that direction, you'd stop them. I could get into the spot from here if I was wearing spikes and I caught myself halfway down on what's left of what I'm assuming is a lightning-struck tree, but it's a pretty dumb way to do it, and getting up and out is even more problematic. Here's the view up and out from inside the spot, so that doesn't really make sense as a path. So it's pretty well isolated once you get in there, at least physically. There's a bit of ground hidden behind this smaller boulder that you can walk up to, but you just wind up with nowhere to go since there's a 5 or 6 foot drop off if you keep going that direction. But my favorite spot is right here, right under the tree. And here's a better view, and this is the spot where I spent the most time, sitting right here. It looks something like this, but only comfortable. You can rest a foot in the nook of the smaller tree and rest another one on a root. It's pretty great if you're the type of person who couldn't sleep for days before going on a trip, because you convince yourself something will look different if you go again, and then you arrive at the spot and it's exactly how you remember from a previous trip, but for some reason that relieves your anxiety. Then you can just take a 5-hour nap to start your trip. There's a cubby behind you where you can keep your sandwich and a 6-pack, and the large rock is on your left, and you're basically sitting over top the alcove entrance. Here's another video from the same spot, and along the right side is the tree to lean against, and then you can look out and watch the trout. This is roughly the angle from which the earlier video with John Charles was taken, where I hung my texting machine from the tree to film. I think this angle shows how narrow the entrance to this spot is, where looking down from the window needs to be pretty precise to point into this spot, since going much further you completely miss the spot due to this other boulder. For the poem, the real question to me was whether I had enough clues, where Forrest says in the book there are 9. My first 6 clues are the first 6 lines in stanzas 2 and 3. Mine might be different from most because I consider no paddle, heavy loads, and water high to be related to one clue, because they are not distinct. All 3 are descriptors of the rise itself, and none of the 3 make it a different direction, distance, or location. That meant I should have 2 clues in stanza 4. I think you could break it like this, where finding the blaze puts you in position, and the final clue is to the exact spot. But my approach broke it like this. Clue 8 is the act of looking down, with a lot of pieces going into that clue, but it's just getting me to turn into that spot. Then, but tarry scant with marvel gaze, just take the chest and go in peace, would suggest that the place where you would be in position to take the chest is a place where a marvel gaze might be occurring, which would be my final clue. I think it makes the poem seem kind of clumsy if arguably the most interesting language of "but tarry scant with marvel gaze" was just a throwaway and not part of a clue. To address that aspect, Ramblin' Pam was kind enough to let me cite a clip from one of her videos. I don't know her personally, but I think her videos are the perfect example of what the chase should have been, and she would have been the perfect finder in my opinion. She happened to go to Sinks Canyon, and this is a clip from that video.
This is the Sinks. So we asked, and the name of the river is Poposia. Not Popoaggie, Poposia. Look at all those fish down there.
I think that reaction of being impressed by all the fish is a pretty good representation of how most people probably react to the view from the overlook. And near the rise, there's one particular place where people would be looking in amazement. So for me, Terry Scant with Marvel Gaze meant the spot where you pick up the chest is where you can be seen by people who have come to marvel at the trout. The Marvel Gaze is not your own, and this shot is great since you can see the shadow of the overlook. I thought this could have also been the answer to Forrest's coded words from Jenny Kyle's book, where if you are in the right spot, something you probably haven't thought about should be obvious to you. My 8th clue takes you into that spot, but it's someone else's Marvel Gaze that directs you to a precise location. And back to the spot where this picture was taken facing the overlook from just in front of the alcove, and the overlook is right about here out of your line of sight. And here's the view of the spot from the overlook where we went into the spot here behind this smaller boulder. And if we take a closer look from the overlook, the alcove would be right about here. My tree is right here, and you can sit behind it without being seen. Even having the benefit of searching in winter where everything is as sparse as it will ever be, no one is watching you in the alcove or my tree. The one spot where someone could get a look at you would be standing right here. Let's take a look at this video where I walk up to that spot. We're facing the overlook, and even standing with the camera face level and having the grass dormant and laying down because it's still winter here, no one is getting a good look at you. But if you walk up to that edge, this is the overlook, so now you can be seen from the overlook, and we can know the place we started for the first time. We're basically in a spot where you could do just a few things with the chest. You could leave it at ground level and scatter debris on it if you wanted, but since it's such a tight area, you could bury it and you'd literally be standing right on top of it at the last clue. Or you could tuck it into the rocks in front of you, but you'd still be close enough where you could kick it. There's also a significant drop-off in front of here where you can't just leave the spot by continuing to go forward. And here's a video of where you could tuck it in. This little cubby was like this, at least since November. I didn't dig it out to look like this, and I was using gypsy magic on the entire spot since November in general, like around my tree, and for 40 pounds of metal, Forrest would have had to dig a pretty wild hole to conceal it from even Fisher-Price brand gypsy magic. But I think in terms of how the clues can take you to a precise spot and a place where you could still lay down next to the chest and not be seen, this approach is pretty decent for being wrong. If Forrest had buried it here, 3 feet deep in the ground, I don't think you could say that was unreasonable or that the clues weren't precise enough. I could detail the area around here, but my guess was if you couldn't say within touching distance where the chest should go, it's not right unless the solve is just a clunker, especially in view of this quote where Forrest states, "You can't have a correct solve unless you can knowingly go to within several steps of the treasure chest." I don't think the clues take me to a precise spot other than right here. Maybe when Forrest said, if followed precisely in the book, he meant you needed to haphazardly walk around looking for a marker that may or may not still even exist or be recognizable. That's entirely on me if I interpreted that statement too narrowly, but I was never going to search like that anyway. So if you told me I needed to bury something 3 feet deep in Sinks Canyon and have someone arrive at the precise spot using the poem without gypsy magic and still be in a spot where you could lay down next to it, there's one spot where I would put it. Not here or here so much, but right here. To tie up some loose ends as to the 200 and 500 footers, the easy one is the people who have been within 500 feet. It would be the people who routinely mention, "Oh hey Forrest, we went to Sinks Canyon and fed the fish or saw the trout." I think that's pretty much all you need to say to get on the 500 footer list. The 200 footers would have to be people who are detailing their activities near the rise and maybe sent a picture of the wooden sign, or there's an interesting boulder on top of a boulder on the opposite side of the road a bit further north. But anyway, it's basically the hypothetical scenario I started out with, so it's a pretty amazing coincidence. For analyzing potential approaches, though, I think having the 500-foot location be at the first clue makes certain quotes more interesting, like this one where Forrest states, "Others were at the starting point, but their arrival might have been an aberration." The starting point mentioned by Forrest seems to have the hallmarks of what I'd expect in the 500-foot location, where it's something people are inclined to mention to Forrest irrespective of whether they think it's related to the poem, and the 500-foot location is something you could briefly mention, but it would still put you at a relatively precise location like on the overlook. If people kept telling me that they were feeding the fish or seeing the fish, I'd probably say I know people have been within 500 feet and that I think people have been within a couple hundred feet, which is how Forrest stated it in this quote that I showed earlier. I think for approaches where you are actually following clues on the ground and not far but too far to walk is treated as the third or later clue, it could explain how people are getting the first and second but going past the treasure chest, since clues 3 and 4 are close by and they keep overshooting not far but too far to walk. And for my approach, the fourth clue is where you're meant to park and puts you within 200 feet if you had gotten it correct. One other thing I like about this place is based on the third and fourth lines of the poem, which I haven't really discussed. And when Forrest says, "I can keep my secret where," it seems like some people treat secret as a noun and then say, "This sentence makes no sense, it should be a question." But it makes sense if where is a noun, which it can be, and read it as "I can keep my secret place," and the hint would be relevant to the place. And as for riches, being rich doesn't strictly apply to gold and monetary issues, it can apply to natural resources. And for natural resources, new and old, I think it makes a lot of sense to consider the trout to be the riches, and you can consistently find young and old trout here. As with most things, this idea has been floated around, since I know Mike Cowling discussed it shortly before the find was announced, but with respect to water as a natural resource. That's pretty much it, and now the only question is how to deal with the ending. I was sort of already doing that even before the find was announced, since I felt like I got to a place where there was nowhere left to go, but I still kept going back to look. And when I originally recorded my approach, I thought maybe I was experiencing just a tiny fraction of what Forrest might have when he thought nature was putting a premature end to his life. But looking back, I don't think that's accurate. It never really felt like I enjoyed the chase itself as much as I enjoyed sitting in my tree, not even searching. I was pretty much convinced I'd never see the clues any other way, and it was either go back to my tree or give up on the chase. When I was away from the rise, I kept telling myself I should go back and maybe I'd see things differently. So I'd go through the motions of thinking of different things to try, but when I was physically there, I didn't really mind if that's where and how it was going to end for me, and I was content to just sit in my tree for most of the time. And don't worry, this wolf was just taking a nap. See, it was fine. So I don't know, even if I had gotten close, it might be that I just found out that I'm even more different from Forrest than I thought, especially since even if I could do things over, I wouldn't do anything differently. I had hoped that Forrest would say something after the find to maybe give some context about why the spot mattered to him or the types of things he thought about at his spot, but that's the problem with understanding. Even if I had figured out the clues and why the spot mattered, I still probably wouldn't understand the spot the way Forrest did. That's very specific to me, though. I believe other people when they say they need the solve. For people who were in the chase longer than me, which is pretty much everyone, I could see how a big piece is missing, and a lot of them might even understand the meaning of the place on their own, so I hope they get that. But now that Forrest is not around to provide context, I don't know if anything is going to change for me. The upside is, I already know the perfect place to go soon to just sit and think about uncertainty and impermanence. And if I feel content being there, even if I still don't have all the answers or see what lured me there initially, then I think I'll be ready to move on. But it's not in Sinks Canyon. It's this average valley in Yellowstone, and this is where my quest halts.